So yesterday morning, I started with the number 40 years. This morning, I'm going to start with 16 years. Because 16 years ago, I ended one of my sermons with a story, and it is perfect for the start of my sermon this morning. So I thought briefly about how, 16 years, how many people are actually going to remember it? But in the spirit of Rosh Hashanah, I've decided to come clean, in case any of you do remember it. So here it is. This is a portion of an actual radio conversation between a U.S. naval ship and Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland in October of 1995. Canadians, please divert your course by 15 degrees south to avoid a collision. Americans, recommend that you divert your course 15 degrees north to avoid a collision. Canadians, negative. You have to divert your course 15 degrees south to avoid a collision. Americans, this is the captain of a U.S. Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Canadians, no, I say again, divert your course. Americans, this is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the United States Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course by 15 degrees north. I say again, that's 15 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, this is a lighthouse. Your call. Adamant, bullheaded, hard-nosed, headstrong, immovable, implacable, intransigent, uncompromising, unyielding. This aspect of human behavior is something that often stands as an obstacle for the work that we do on these high holy days. Many times we know where we must go and we know what we must do, but we just can't seem to get there. And it's often because we dig in our heels and become immovable, even when the destructive path and patterns that we are in are so obvious to the world around us. I often find myself thinking about this as I read through our Torah, especially the sections when we're in the desert and we fall back into these actions that are going to get us into trouble time and time again. We just passed through the Red Sea, saw miracles that would amaze and convince any of us today of the existence of God. We complain, we rebel, and we build our golden calves. And it's at these moments that we acquire the well-known moniker, as it says in Exodus 32, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe ra'iti et ha'am hazeh v'hinei am kshe orefu. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Yep, that we are. And this is by no means the only place that we are referred to in this way. Just one chapter later, we hear it again. We're told that we would be entering into the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. But God tells us, I will not go in your midst, since you are a stiff-necked people, lest I destroy you on your way. So challenging is this aspect of who we are that it threatens our very survival. God is saying, look, if I have to be around that all day long, I may well obliterate you all. What is it about this trait that makes it so challenging? How do we know when we're acting that way, and what can we do to make it better? Rashi, in his interpretation on Exodus 32, defines it as follows. They turned their stiff necks towards those who reprove them and refuse to listen. For Rashi, it's not just merely being obstinate or even being sure of one's own opinions, but it's about being closed off to others, especially when they're trying to correct you, to help you, or to open you up to new possibilities. Theologian Richard Niebuhr, who is actually the younger brother of Reinhold Niebuhr, who we all know from First They Came from the Jews. He was a theologian in his own right, and he teaches, there is no greater barrier to understanding than the assumption that the standpoint which we happen to occupy is a universal one. My friends, it is the height of hubris to believe that we and we alone have the right answer. And our tradition goes out of its way to remind us to listen to the opinions of others, even if we don't ultimately agree. But sometimes we get so entrenched in our positions or our view of the world that we just can't seem to find a way out, even if it's so clearly not to our benefit. Rabbi Todd Zinn, in a sermon he gave about 2 years ago, reminds us that when the Israelites were freed, they were not able to immediately give up on the Egyptian narratives that they have adopted. For many generations, they had accepted and been a part of Egyptian culture, and they weren't able to immediately let go of the idols and the gods. Even though they witnessed the miracles, even though they saw the 10 plagues and the splitting of the sea, they couldn't accept a world without the institution of idols or gods. We become unable to extricate ourselves from the intellectual rut created by our own actions and beliefs. We continue the same destructive patterns, even though we know deep down it's not good for us. Jobs that are toxic, relationships that are abusive. It takes a monumental will and effort to break the hold that they have on us, and even when we do, we're often judged for it. Take the most talked about story of the recent Olympics, that of Simone Biles. She made what will probably be the most difficult decision of her life, prioritizing her own mental health, and very likely her physical health as well, by withdrawing. How many athletes have put themselves at risk before her by succumbing to the pressure of staying the course no matter what? None of us knows the factors that she weighed, and yet we all seem to have an opinion, and the response by some was more than disappointing. It shows the problem, the depths of the problem that we have in today's world, believing that we have all the information about what's best for everyone around us. She was called selfish, immature, a shame to the country, a sociopath. One pundit said, Simone Biles showed the rest of the nation that when things get tough, you shatter to a million pieces. What right do we have to tell any other human being to do something that we ourselves would never do or could never do? She wasn't there for them. She wasn't there for us. She was there to be the best Simone Biles that she could be. And at that moment, it meant being a shining example of doing what is right for her, even though it was hard. It's so interesting to me that as I did the research for this sermon, I looked up the antonyms for obstinate and stiff-necked. And here's what I found. Pliant, amenable, surrendering, obedient, submissive, yielding. In the 21st century, these ideas have become associated with weakness and failure, pushing us all the more to hold our ground no matter what and close ourselves off to other ideas and opinions. As we ask ourselves why, it comes down to fear. Fear of admitting that we don't know something or that we can't do something because that might mean that somebody else wins. Life in the modern world has become all about competition. And yet, as we look at our history, some of the greatest moments of humanity have often come when we allow for cooperation as well. No single musician, no matter how talented, can ever play a concerto or a symphony all by themselves. To get to that degree of greatness, we need to let go of our ego, to let go of our need to be the one and become part of something more. This is the basis of the Jewish idea of minyan and community. I believe that the modern world, ironically with all of its access to information, has also made it increasingly difficult for us to hold multiple ideas in our minds at once. We are so overloaded with information that we have no choice but to just stick to what we know and what we think we know in the face of that deluge of information. Any more information, any more variables would push us over the edge of what we can handle, and so we don't. We close ourselves off and dig in our heels, and out of pure stiff-necked stubbornness, we argue our positions no matter what. Now, I imagine some of you are thinking, but Rabbi, when it comes to important values, to those ideals in our lives, when others are challenging them, shouldn't we be strong? Shouldn't we steel ourselves to defend them? We can even cite a midrash. Rabbi Yitzchak said in the name of Rabbi Ami, you think that stiff-necked is said disparagingly, but it's really praise. To this very day, the midrash says, the Israelites of the diaspora are called the stiff-necked people. It's a good thing to stand up for what we believe. It's a good thing to maintain our values and principles, even if it's difficult, and there are many others who do not. It's a good thing to remember that just because the opinion is the majority doesn't necessarily mean it's right. And we may be called on as Jews to fix the world around us. That takes strength. That takes resilience. Our tradition actually does see some benefit of being shei oref, stiff-necked. It was Rabbi Meir who said in Masechet Beitzah, why was the Torah given to Israel? Because they were strong-willed. A little later in the Braita, it calls us fiery. On the surface, these are seen as good things, allowing us to cope with the world around us. And according to this, it was because we were those things, because we were so strong, that we merited receiving Torah. However, the great explainer Rashi understands this section differently. He said that the Torah was given to us so that when we use it, it would, quote, weaken our strength and humble our hearts. According to him, Torah is there to mitigate and moderate. It's there to help us live in a world with others and to create a community that is reflective of both God and a diverse people who live in it. While there are indeed times to be strong, our tradition tells us to live with compassion for others. And one cannot do that if all others see is the back of our neck. The best explanation I found comes from Ovadia ben Yaakov Sforno. He's an Italian rabbi who wrote in the early 16th century, and in his comments on Deuteronomy, he teaches, being stiff-necked and righteous simultaneously is a non-starter, as these two character qualities are mutually exclusive. Being stiff-necked means to follow the dictates of one's own heart, one's own opinions, instead of accepting the yoke of the Creator's commandments. Such a person, he argues, will reject even theories which have been proven beyond a doubt if they conflict with what they deem is good and convenient for themselves. Sound familiar? Does that sound like anyone you know? Maybe even does it sound like ourselves? It's so easy to fall into the habit of being shei oref. Perhaps that's why this time of year it appears numerous times in the list of sins for which we are here to repent. We will see it on Yom Kippur in the Al-Chet. We will hear it again when we sing, Kishinu Oref. It appears elsewhere in the liturgy as well, enough times to try and make it clear to us that this is something we need to work on as individuals and as a community. And it's tough. So what do? What loosens our stiff necks? Over the last few years, I've been speaking more and more about the midot, the spiritual attributes that our tradition espouses. The midah of rachamim, of compassion, is something that we ask of God during these high holy days. But it's also something that we need to ask of ourselves if we are to combat obstinance. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch writes that compassion is the feeling of empathy in which the pain of one awakens in another, which like a voice from heaven penetrates the heart. And author Brene Brown, who also speaks a great deal of compassion, says, compassion is not a virtue, it's a commitment. It's not something that we have or we don't have. It's something that we choose to practice. To have compassion for someone else necessitates a focus on them and an attention to their needs. The more we practice compassion, the more we're unable to turn our backs on those around us and think just of ourselves. The more we loosen the stiffness that prevents us from feeling what others around us are feeling. The second attribute is one that is brought to us by Rambam as a direct antidote to being stiff-necked. And he says it is politeness. Politeness, he writes, is another virtue promoted by law. Man shall listen to the words of his neighbor, he shall not be obstinate, but shall yield to the wish of his fellow men, respond to their appeal, act according to their desire, and do what they like. This is a brilliant response to the problem of kshe oref. Common courtesy is based on the acknowledgement of the other. Being polite, even if you vehemently disagree, shapes the conversation into something that allows two people to actually hear each other, something I spoke a great deal about last year. However, ultimately, if we truly want to remove the sin of kshe oref from our lives, then we need to become aware of it in ourselves. Executive coach Muriel Wilkins wrote in Harvard Business Review that there are things that we can look for to see if we have to work on stubbornness. 1, you keep at an idea or a plan or insist on making your point even when you know you're wrong. 2, you do something you want to do even if no one else wants to do it. 3, when others present an idea, you're the one to point out all the reasons that it won't work. 4, you visibly feel anger, frustration, and impatience when others try to persuade you of something that you don't agree with, and you expect them to be calm and listen to you when you're doing the same. And 5, you agree or commit half-heartedly to others' requests when you know all along that you're going to do something else entirely different. My friends, we come together on Rosh Hashanah to begin a process of self-improvement. The realization that we all carry the sin of being too stiff-necked, sometimes so much so that we can't even admit that we're imperfect, is a starting point. It's good to be strong. It's good to be who we are and be proud of that. Actually, it brings me back to the story that I began with. The lighthouse. It is what it is. Those inside are strong and immovable, not because they have a desire to be, but because that's their purpose. The naval vessels, on the other hand, At each iteration of the conversation, they try to make themselves be larger and more important. They were unwilling to look beyond themselves and to adapt to the reality of the world. We can continue to bluster and bellow and rail at the world because it does not fit our image of what we believe that it should be. Or we can learn to open our eyes to the reality of the world around us and make those course corrections necessary to ensure our well-being and the well-being of the community around us. It's our call. Shana Tova.